Let's move on. OK, we now come to the next urgent question. Carla Denyer. Carla Denyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Foreign Secretary to make a statement about the Israeli government's announcement that it is expanding its military operation in Gaza.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are deeply concerned about the resumption of hostilities in Gaza. The UK does not support an expansion of Israel's military operations. Continued fighting and more bloodshed is in nobody's interest. All parties, including Israel, must observe international humanitarian law. We urge all parties to return to dialogue and ceasefire negotiations, ensuring the return of all who have endured unimaginable suffering. It is clear that this conflict cannot be won by bombs and bullets, but by diplomacy. Aid should never be used as a political tool. Israel must restart the flow of aid immediately. Blocking goods supplies and power entering Gaza risks breaching international humanitarian law, and it should not be happening. We're doing everything we can to alleviate that situation. Gaza is also the most dangerous place in the world to be an aid worker. Over 400 aid workers have been killed since the start of the conflict. Despite renewed fighting, the United Nations and humanitarian organisations must be able to deliver their vital work. A year on from the appalling attack on the World Central Kitchen aid workers, lessons have not been learned. We're appalled at recent attacks on aid workers, including on a UNOPS guest house and the killing of at least 8 Palestinian Red Crescent medics. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. Those responsible must be held accountable. The government of Israel must urgently ensure that there are effective deconfliction mechanisms in place to enable agencies to deliver their impartial mandates safely. On 28th March, the UK and France called an urgent UN Security Council meeting to discuss the risks facing humanitarian aid workers in Gaza. Since the hostilities resumed, the Foreign Secretary has spoken to Secretary Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, Israeli Minister for Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer, EU High Representative Callas, and the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher. A return to a ceasefire is the only way we will bring this conflict to an end and return to negotiations for a lasting peace in the region. That is the only way to deliver the two-state solution we all want to see. Both Israelis and Palestinians have the right to live in peace and security.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Israeli government's brutal decision to expand its military operations in Gaza is not security. It is domination and erasure. It comes on top of 18 months of collective punishment, including, since the 2nd of March, the longest aid blockade since the war began. I welcome the confirmation from the Minister that the UK does not support the Israeli government's expanded military operation in Gaza. Will the Minister now finally name what is happening as genocide and undertake a structural investigation into genocide and other crimes under international law committed in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories? And to ensure that the UK is not complicit with Israel's ongoing genocide, illegal occupation and system of apartheid, will he immediately suspend the direct and indirect supply, sale or transfer, including transit and transshipment, to Israel of all weapons, munitions and other military and security equipment? Will he immediately suspend the provision of training and other military and security assistance and recognise that otherwise there is a clear risk of contributing to the commission of serious violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, including crimes under international law? The UK, as the Minister mentioned, is a significant provider of humanitarian aid to the region, so can he tell us what assessment he's made of the impact of today's reports on the humanitarian crisis. And although the Minister touched on this slightly, given the UK's level of influence with Israeli authorities, could he confirm that he will use his position to actively oppose current and planned attempts by Israel to establish a permanent military presence in Gaza, and to oppose moves to alter Gaza's borders and demographic makeup, to shrink its territory, including through any expanded buffer zones and construction of permanent checkpoints? Lastly, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady asks important questions. As I've said to this House on a number of occasions, determinations of breaches of serious international law are for competent courts, and we support those courts in their work. She raises a series of questions. On weapons, I want to be clear, we continue to stand by the assessments that we made soberly in September and the suspensions of licences that involved. She asked about the UK's view on a permanent presence in Gaza. We remain clearly of the view, and I'm happy to restate our policy now. We welcome the proposal by Arab nations called the Arab Initiative, which would allow for a reconstruction of Gaza, the safe return of Palestinians who've been displaced, and for those still remaining in Gaza, that they would be able to rebuild their lives without forced displacement, which we oppose.
Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've had several urgent statements and questions on Gaza over the last few months. Each time I've come to the Chamber and I've asked the government, what is Plan B? What is Plan B when Israel ends the ceasefire, which is what has happened? What is Plan B when Israel's far-right government chooses its survival over the lives of the remaining hostages, which is what seems to have happened? What is Plan B when annexation, either of the West Bank or of Gaza, isn't just threatened, but what actually happens, which is what is happening now? So my question is this. What is this government actually doing to turn our allies' heads from American trade wars to the tragedy unfolding in the Middle East and do whatever they can to restore a ceasefire and the road to peace?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, who has been pressing these issues for some time, is right to raise these questions. She asks whether there is a Plan B. In all of my experience, there can be no Plan B in Israel-Palestine. There is only one route, widely understood by our allies in the region and beyond, and it must be a two-state solution. The route to a two-state solution must involve compliance with international humanitarian law. It is clear from even the short exchange we have had already in the Chamber that the British government's policy and the Israeli government's policy differs. It is going to continue to differ until we return to a pathway to a two-state solution. There is no Plan B. Our Plan A is for a two-state solution, and we will work with our allies, both in the region, in the Security Council, as we did on Friday, and more closer to home, in order to pursue those arguments.
Dame Priti Patel, the Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Thank you for granting this urgent question, Mr. Speaker. This is clearly a very difficult and dangerous moment for the Middle East, and a way must be found through this dreadful impasse that has led to the breakdown of the ceasefire agreement. As has been said time and time again, the key to a sustainable end to this conflict is the release of the remaining 59 hostages so cruelly being held by Hamas terrorists since the atrocities of October the 7th. Their continued captivity is intolerable. The British government should be able to bring influence to bear, and the Foreign Secretary should be directly involved in all efforts to find a way through, working with Israeli counterparts, the US and key regional players and mediator countries. We said this in the House yesterday as well. And yesterday in this chamber, the Minister stated that the government is in regular contact with all those involved in negotiations, including the Foreign Secretary, and he said it today as well. He was speaking to his Israeli counterpart last week. So can he inform the House what direct minister-to-minister discussions have taken place about the current military operations? Were ministers informed in advance? And have they been given any information about the objective Israel are seeking? Every week we are all here asking questions here of ministers, and it's unclear exactly what level of influence the government has. What is the government's plan? What is their vision of a way through? What discussions have they had in recent days with vital interlocutors? And on the issue of humanitarian aid, does he feel he has made any progress in his efforts to try to unblock the current aid access situation? Can he update the House on what has been happening to British aid? We've spoken about this many times. Where is that aid? While the restrictions are remaining, what has happened to that aid? And finally, Mr. Speaker, it was our position in government, and indeed it's the position of the Labour government, that there can be no role for Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists in Gaza's future. Will he be proposing a roadmap to our critical partners about this, how this will end and how this becomes a reality?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady asked important questions. The Foreign Secretary has been directly involved in minister-to-minister contact. I too have been talking with all of those affected. I very much welcome the comments about the hostages. Of course, this whole House wants to see them all released, and I'm sure many of us will be thinking of Avinatan or with a British mother who is still held in almost certainly terrible conditions and has continued to be held ever since October the 7th. And I know the whole House will continue to think of those hostage victims. She asks rightly about humanitarian aid. She asked rightly about humanitarian aid. And I will accept that our efforts in recent days to try and prevent a blockade from continuing in Gaza have not been effective. We have seen, at the first part of this year, a very welcome increase in aid going into Gaza, including UK aid. Even during that greater flow, there were still restrictions that were unwelcome on the nature of the aid that went in, that made reconstruction, shelter, tents, sleeping bags hard to get into Gaza when they were desperately needed. So there were improvements. We can see a route to which we might see a significant increase of aid into the Gaza Strip, which is desperately needed. But at the current time, the reports are extremely depressing, and we discussed some of them yesterday. She asks about our plan for reconstruction and what discussions we have with others. We have discussed the Arab initiative with those involved closely. We think it is a plan with real merit. It must not allow Hamas to have a role in governance. We are absolutely clear on that point. I think Arab partners are very much of the same view, but that is the basic idea from which we must work.
Mohamed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 30th of March, the first day of Eid, Israeli attacks on Gaza killed dozens of Palestinians, adding to the death toll since Israel breached the ceasefire agreement. Israel is now in the process of enacting the largest forced displacements, ordering hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Rafah. Mr. Speaker, how will this end? Israel cannot and will not stop. Is the goal ethnic cleansing? We are witnessing this. Is the goal complete destruction of Gaza? We are now witnessing this. Is the goal permanent occupation of Gaza and the West Bank? We continue to witness this. Is the goal a complete end to the two-state solution? Israeli ministers have made their intentions clear. Will the minister unequivocally condemn their actions for what they are, war crimes and crimes against humanity?
My honourable friend has been fearless and persistent on these questions, and I do condemn the comments of Israeli ministers which amount to forced displacement or annexation of Palestinian territories. We recognise international humanitarian law, and we call on all of our allies, including Israel, to also abide by it. The scenes in Gaza have been hard to watch in recent days, and we will continue to make these points to the Israelis with all the force that she would expect.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Monica Harding.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israel's expansion of military activity in Gaza, including a strike on UN medical facilities, displacement of civilians, and the Defence Minister's new proposal to seize large swathes of territory is gravely disturbing. It seems international humanitarian law is being violated. This week's reports that IDF forces killed and buried 15 humanitarian workers in a mass grave is also appalling. The ceasefire must be restored. Israel must immediately end its illegal blockade of humanitarian aid into Gaza to bring desperately needed relief to 2 million people who have suffered enormously, and Hamas must release the remaining hostages immediately and unconditionally. Will the Minister update the House on the conversations he is having with Israeli, American and Middle Eastern partners regarding the restoration of the ceasefire? All sides must recommit to a political process. He says there is only one route. So I will ask the Minister once again if this government will now recognise a Palestinian state, giving hope to millions of Palestinians. And will he outline what the UK is doing to hold those who attack aid workers in violation of international humanitarian law accountable and protect those aid workers who remain in Gaza?
The questions raised are important ones about, let me start with humanitarian aid workers, and the whole House would have heard the Prime Minister responding to my honourable friend, the member for Truro and Falmouth. We of course do want to see accountability when humanitarian workers are struck. We particularly expect accountability when it is British nationals who are affected, and my thoughts are with the whole families of all of those affected by the World Central Kitchen incident. What do we want to see next by way of accountability? We want to see the Israeli Military Advocate General going through the investigation at a proper speed. It has been 1 year, coming to proper findings and answering the question of whether or not criminal charges should now be laid. On the questions of the recognition of a Palestinian state, this House has discussed them many times. We will recognise a Palestinian state as part of a contribution to a two-state solution. We are all watching the events in the occupied Palestinian territories at the moment and seeing how distant a functional Palestinian state looks like under these circumstances. And our first efforts must be to restore the basic function of Palestinian life, both in Gaza and in West Bank, where it is also under threat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited the occupied Palestinian territories with the Foreign Affairs Committee. I travelled to Area C in West Bank and I saw firsthand the settler violence that Palestinian men, women and children are facing day in, day out. They are living their lives in constant fear. In this House, we all support a two-state solution, but this is being undermined daily by the actions of the Israeli government, especially in the West Bank. We're seeing it being annexed in real time. The Minister says that we will recognise the state of Palestine when the time is right, but I fear there may be no state left to recognise. Will the government look again at stopping all settlement goods coming into the UK?
These are important questions. The UK considers settlements illegal under international law. We are clear that settlement goods must be properly labelled and they do not benefit for the trading regimes that would otherwise apply both to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. My honourable friend's question is the right one. We need to ensure that there remains a viable path to a two-state solution. There is no other path to peace in the region, and all of our efforts are focused on that outcome.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
Mr. Speaker, when I was the Minister responsible, the Minister now was an outstanding official in that department. So he will know that when I presented an egregious list of complaints to the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel and the Chief Negotiator, he simply stormed from the meeting, leaving the ambassador with his head in his hands. So I ask, what leverage do we actually have?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is kind about my service, and I know that he raised some of these issues with some force, as he says, in his time in my role. And it underlines, I think, the hard truth here, which is the Israelis must be persuaded to relent from a course of action which both parties have seen, and others, the other parties as well in this chamber, have seen is totally undermining to the long-term stability of the region, which is important not just for Israel, not just for Palestine, but for the UK and our friends and allies in the Middle East.
Blair McDougall.
Mr. Speaker, the poor people of Gaza trapped between Hamas, who refused to release the 59 hostages, and Defence Minister Katz now threatening total destruction of Gaza. I wonder if the Minister shares my despair at the lack of leadership that is committed to peace, and I wonder if we can talk about what diplomatic efforts and through perhaps aid spending we are making to try to create moderate leadership in the region which can create the long-term circumstances for peace and reconciliation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend has done much work over the years on questions of peace building. We too are committed to playing our part in trying to build up the connections between the two societies that could allow for the kind of moderate leadership at the very most local level that is so necessary for making peace. We saw that in our own experience of Northern Ireland. Many in this chamber have rightly pressed us on all MEP's proposals, and we will look forward in the coming period to setting out what we will be doing to support peace-building efforts. I watch, as the Foreign Secretary does, with dismay on both sides, with the many civilians asking for peace, the many civilians protesting both in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories for a return to a ceasefire. That is what we want to see.
Let's jump forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard ministers refer many times to the risk of breaches of international humanitarian law. On the one occasion, on the 17th of March, where the Foreign Secretary admitted that withholding aid to Gaza was a breach of international law, he had to retract the admission and refer again to a risk of breaches. If the recent attacks on aid workers constitute a further risk of breaches, can the Minister outline what would constitute an actual breach?
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has clarified his comments on the occasion that the honourable gentleman refers to, and the honourable gentleman will know well from his own background that it is a long-standing policy of governments of all kinds that it is not for ministers to act as courts. There are competent international courts who make these determinations.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The resumption of the conflict in Gaza is incredibly tragic, and it's especially heartbreaking for the hostage families and all those brave people we have seen protesting in Israel against their government and in Gaza against the death cult that is Hamas. Would the Minister agree with me that the conflict today could end if Hamas released the 59 hostages and left Gaza to live in peace and security? And will the Minister update us on plans for the international plan for peace for Israelis and Palestinians?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is right. Hostages must be released. Hamas can play no role in the future governance of Gaza, and their role, which was described by the Shadow Foreign Secretary correctly as supported by Iran, has been malign. Malign for the Palestinians, malign for the Israelis, malign for the UK, and malign for the region. On his question about the proposal for the International Peace Building Fund, we will come back to this House with further details of our approach. As the situation continues to evolve, we want to carefully consider how best we can contribute to peace building in the way that my honourable friend asked in one of the previous questions.
Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his answer to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, can I thank the Minister for raising the plight of Abtisam Or, who I'm proud to be twinned with. He was brutally captured by Hamas terrorists now 544 days ago. In March, his family received a sign of life for the first time, and in that same month, a number of colleagues heard from his mother, Ditsa, who is a British citizen, moving story in Parliament, and her continued plight for her son's release. Does the Minister agree that Hamas could end the war now by releasing Abtisam and all the remaining hostages? And will he assure Ditsa that all avenues are being pursued by this government to make that a reality?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for mentioning Ditsa. I too met her recently, and indeed Avinatan's sister. These are two incredibly strong women doing absolutely everything that they can for their loved one, and I can assure them from this dispatch box that we are doing everything we can to secure his release.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I associate myself with the Minister's remarks about the killings of the British World Central Kitchen workers by Israel and Gaza, and I extend this sentiment to Palestinian aid workers too. It's almost a year since I was last in Gaza, and there's not a day goes by when I don't think about what I saw. Does the Minister agree with me that what Israel is doing in Gaza is new and uncharted territory in its level of danger, both to Palestinians and to the prospects of a two-state solution ever being realised? Does he further agree with me that it is past time for fresh, coordinated international action to stop this? And when will he be able to come to the House to outline what this action will be?
My honourable friend has seen events in Gaza with her own eyes, and I know from all of her work before she came to this place how committed not just an advocate but an actor she has been for those suffering some of the most unimaginable pressures and horrors. And they continue, I agree, they continue to suffer those pressures and see those horrors. We took the step of calling the UN Security Council to session on these questions on Friday, solemnly and soberly. We will work with our international partners on these questions. They are egregious threats, both to the life of Palestinians, to a two-state solution, to the stability of the region. And I will be back to this House to give her further updates, as you would expect.
Leila Moran. We need a ceasefire now, again. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the situation on the ground is as bad as it has ever been, if not worse. I spoke to my friend whose family are in Gaza. He told me that last week their home was bombed multiple times while they were sheltering in the basement with no food or water. They're now barely surviving, surrounded by destruction, terrified, without aid for over a month. He said this is not self-defence. This is the destruction of families like mine. So if this government doesn't support this escalation, where are the consequences? We do have leverage. Why have they not suspended all arms sales to the IDF? Not because of a risk of it hitting civilians, but because we have principles and we will show intent.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for sharing the story in the Chamber. I know that many members of this House are receiving similar stories over the last few days, and indeed have been for the last 18 months that this conflict has been running. I've set out our position on arms a number of times in this House, and I would like to say that the decisions taken in September were decisions of principle. They remain decisions of principle, and the two principles that underline our position in relation to arms licences for sale to Israel are both that we are concerned about risks of international humanitarian law and that we will continue to defend Israel against threats to its security and safety, including from Iran. We have both suspended weapons that could be sold to Israel, and we have flown the RAF in their defence when Iran threatened to strike them with missiles. The world is incredibly complicated. It is moving very quickly, and I recognise the strength of feeling in this House on the question of arms. Our position remains the same, and it is one of principle.
Tan Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. What we are witnessing in Gaza is the weaponisation of starvation, with an ongoing blockade of food, water, medicines and shelter now into its second month. There is also the heart-wrenching, despicable discovery of the killing of a further 15 aid workers found in a mass grave, and now large-scale hostilities have restarted. This must stop. So, Minister, given it's clear that the Netanyahu regime is not listening to the UK government and will only listen to President Trump, what pressure is our government putting onto the US so that the Israeli government finally ends its aid blockade?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as you would expect, I will confine my comments to the discussions that we have rather than the policy of other allies. But my honourable friend, who's raised these issues many times, is right. I have said it at this dispatch box. The Prime Minister said it at Prime Minister's questions earlier, and the Foreign Secretary reiterated this yesterday. We want the aid blockade to end immediately. It should not have been put in place. Palestinian civilians are suffering, and we expect urgent action. We, of course, discuss these issues with Secretary Rubio, with Special Envoy Steve Wetkoff, and with a whole range of our counterparts in the US system. We work closely with our American colleagues in the Middle East, on the Middle East, and in a whole range of national security fields. And we are clear about our policy with them, as we are with the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask the Minister to bring a sense of urgency to this? The people of Gaza are starving. Every bakery is closed. There's insufficiency of water. There's no power. There's no schools open. There's no hospitals fully functioning. It is an utterly desperate situation. Yet we are still allowing, I believe, RAF Akrotiri to be used as a staging point for Israel. We're still supplying parts for F-35 jets, which are bombing the people of Gaza, bombing the rubble there. What is the government doing to ensure Israel stops the bombing and food aid gets through very, very urgently for the people of Gaza, merely to help them survive?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope the House is under no doubt about the urgency with which myself, the Foreign Secretary, the whole ministerial team treat these issues. I've answered, I think, the question in relation to arms already in this session. The position in relation to the humanitarian needs has been on terrible and vivid display over the last few days. We are aware of the reports to which the Honourable Gentleman refers, and we raise these issues with the urgency they demand.
Paul Wall.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum in Israel said this morning they were horrified to wake up to the news of the expanded military operation, and that's because they know the risk that it poses to their loved ones. But it's the loved ones of Palestinians who've already suffered so much that are most relevant today. And they themselves know that the annexation and the forced displacement of men, women and children is simply unacceptable. So can the Minister tell me exactly what he and this UK government have done to make representations to Israel, both about that Israeli aggression and about the expanded new 13 settlements in the West Bank, which are deliberately designed to suffocate any future state of Palestine?
I can assure my honourable friend, who has been a doughty campaigner on these issues, that we have raised both the risks of returning to war and indeed the settlements he refers to directly with the Israeli government, and we will continue to do so.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's reply today to the urgent question, but I'm sure he'll forgive me if I say we have heard all of this before. And there's a sense of hopelessness in this place, at this downward spiral that we seem to be on. But it must be nothing to the hopelessness that's being felt by the Gazans and also by the Israeli population. The Israeli regime isn't listening to us. It's not listening to its own population, who are protesting and simply want their hostages home. The region needs some hope, and it's been suggested here already today that if we are going to go down the route to a two-state solution, we need to have a breakthrough. That breakthrough might come if this government would recognise Palestine as a state.
I recognise the Honourable Lady's remarks. The sense of hopelessness must be acute in Gaza, and I would say to all of those watching from the region that the UK will continue to do everything we can, no matter how hard it is, to try and return to a ceasefire. I think I've addressed the questions about the recognition of the Palestinian state. There must be a breakthrough. We need to get back onto the path that both sides have been on before if stability is to return to the region.
Could I just make the point to members that there are a lot of right honourable members still wanting to get in. There is an important statement to come in due course, so please can questions be a little briefer. Florence Esher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for coming to the House and for the Honourable Member for Bristol Central for raising this. But I concur with the comments of the Right Honourable Member for Islington South and Finsbury in that we've been here before, Minister. It's the same responses we keep getting. Our constituents continue to write to us about this. They want hope. But the reality is that in the last fortnight, over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed. Today marks a month since Israel broke that ceasefire, blocking critical aid into Gaza, in defiance of international law. So I asked the Minister, I know he's working very hard, and I know the Foreign Secretary is working very hard, what more is it going to take before we as a UK government take a different course of action? Because Israel is not listening to warm words any longer.
I thank my honourable friend for the question, and my constituents in Lincoln have strong views about the horrors that they see, as I know so many constituents right across the country are writing to their members and expressing their views strongly as well. I would not describe our policy as warm words, and I think many of our friends in the region wouldn't describe our words as warm either. We have taken concrete action since becoming the government. We have restored aid to UNRWA, we have taken the arms suspension measures that have been discussed, we have sanctioned settlers, we have continued to use our position of the UN Security Council to try to bring attention and action on some of the most egregious areas of concern. We will continue to do so. I do not promise this House that I will be able to return next time with something different to say. The fact that my remarks may seem repetitive indicates that the problem is difficult. The solution feels distant, but we must continue to work on the path that this whole House knows we must get back to, which is towards a two-state solution.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week, the Foreign Secretary was unequivocal in saying that both sides, Hamas and Israel, were guilty of committing atrocities. Does the Minister agree with the Foreign Secretary that that is the case?
I think the honourable gentleman is trying to return to the question asked by the honourable member for the Liberal Democrats. Just to be clear, on determinations of crimes, we leave that to courts. On risk of determinations, we take action.
Andy McDougall.
Deputy Speaker, as affirmed by the ICJ in its advisory opinion, Israel is violating the peremptory norms of the Palestinian people's right of self-determination, the prohibition against racial discrimination and apartheid, and the prohibition against unlawful use of force. Its occupation of Palestine is illegal and must end as soon as possible. So will the Minister acknowledge that the UK has the duty to suspend all military cooperation and trade with Israel, a duty that stems from a wide range of intersecting international obligations in the face of grave illegalities committed by the State of Israel?
My honourable friend asked me about the advisory opinion of the ICJ. We do accept that the settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories by the Israelis are illegal, and we have been clear about that policy position. We will take some time yet, I'm afraid, to return to this House with a full response to the advisory opinion of the ICJ, which has a number of novel elements of international jurisprudence, and we are considering it with the seriousness and the soberness that it requires. We agree on the fundamentals. The settlements are illegal and they must be brought to an end.
Brian Matthew.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Recent polling suggests that over 60% of Israelis will support any deal that brings the remaining hostages home. If this can be achieved, the likelihood is that peace and indeed rebuilding can be achieved, especially if Egypt can be involved along with finance from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Can the government please push for this?
I can confirm, Madam Deputy Speaker, we want to see all of the hostages returned, and we do want to see a reconstruction plan for Gaza based on the Arab Initiative with the full involvement of the region, a reconstruction plan that can allow Palestinians to remain in their homes.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was devastated to hear of the expansion of military operations in Gaza this week. Alongside the aid blockade in the region, this is a clear breach of international humanitarian law. The Minister has said that he urges Israel to respect IHL. If Israel continues to ignore the international community on this, what concrete steps will we take to hold them accountable?
My honourable friend has served both in our military and as an aid worker, and he knows well and feels strongly, as I know so many in this House do, the agonies of what we're seeing. We have determined that there is a serious risk of breaches of international humanitarian law by the Israeli government. We will continue to press them on these points, and I won't issue further comment on sanctions, which I think was underlying some of his questions. To do so could reduce their impact.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While no one wants to see the continuation of the war in Gaza,
under the terms of the ceasefire agreement, Israel does have the right to take action where there is an immediate threat. And we have seen that, first of all, the Hamas has refused to release hostages. They are now firing rockets into Israel. They're planning further attacks, and indeed they're attacking now their own citizens who protest against them and murdering them. Is it not reasonable in those circumstances for Israel to take action to defend its own country? And should the priority of this government not be to ensure that Hamas release the hostages which they're cruelly and cynically holding, and secondly ensure that UK aid is not used to prop up Hamas and help them to reassert their authority?
I agree with the honourable gentleman. Of course, Israel has the right to legitimate self-defence consistent with international humanitarian law. It is the concerns about the risk of a breach of international humanitarian law that underpins our concerns. The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. Hamas are a threat not just to Israel but to their own people, and I have been absolutely clear on that question on numerous times at this dispatch box. Where there are any reports that Hamas is benefiting from aid going into the Gaza Strip or anywhere else, we take serious action in response.
Stella Priti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If the rule of international law means anything, it also means that we must uphold it. So just as we recognise taking hostages is a breach of international law, so we recognise killing aid workers is a breach of international law. And my constituents will be listening to the Minister, recognising the work that's being done, but completely perplexed as to why we are not doing more to uphold international law in its practice, because he's right to argue that the courts need to be involved in this. He said that he wanted to see this being dealt with by the relevant court, the competent court. Can he explain to my constituents, when he talks about novel elements of jurisprudence delaying our ability to do that, what more would it take for the United Kingdom, through the auspices of the UN Security Council, to make a referral to the ICC, given what we are seeing now, and to uphold directly international human rights law?
My honourable friend asked an important question, and I recognise for constituents in Walthamstow and elsewhere, questions of international law may seem very arcane when we're faced with the kind of images that we are all seeing this morning and have been seeing for months. So let me clarify. On questions of international law, she refers to the ICJ advisory opinion. That is an advisory opinion long in the gestation, which refers to the presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories. It predates the October the 7th attacks. She also refers to the ICC, who have heard referrals in relation to conduct on both sides of the conflict since after the October the 7th attacks. We respond, obviously, in the fullness of time as required by the ICJ, which has taken some time in its complex determinations about the status of the occupied Palestinian territories. We have responded to the timelines required on the ICC and did so late last year.
Andrew George.
Mr. Speaker, we can all see the discomfort of the Minister in having to embroider language and to refer to merely the risk of the breach of international law and not speak as plainly as I think many people in this House wish him to speak on behalf of our country. And of course, we all want to see the hostages freed, just as we want to see freed the 2 million hostages in Gaza who are being held hostage by the murderous IDF, who are treating them with disdain and starving them at present. But if he's not prepared to make the statement, which I think many of us do wish him to make, will he at least admit that the actions of the far-right Israeli government can no longer be described as self-defence?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been accused of many things, but not embroidery. So let me be clear, if there is any doubt. The position to which I stick at this dispatch box about the determinations of law is one that has been held consistently by both parties for a very long time, and there is a good reason why you would not want people stood at this dispatch box making determinations of law. That is why we have courts. That is why there is an international legal order that this country has a proud history of establishing and maintaining. But let me be clear, we have determined that there is a risk of those breaches. We are not making a determination. We are looking to our own laws, in fact passed by the benches opposite, and we are following them through thoroughly and vigorously. And in the discharge of our duties, we have said we think there is a serious risk of breaches of international humanitarian law. That is the same as saying that we think there is a serious risk Israel is not simply acting in its own legitimate self-defence. And that is why we have taken the steps that we have taken.
Tulip Sadiq.
Madam Deputy Speaker, last year I raised the concerns of a constituent whose family member was stuck in Gaza without food or water. The situation has worsened since the aid blockade, and I'm particularly worried about the escalation of hostilities impacting women and girls most. We know that female hygiene products are at a critical low, there are women giving births on hospital floors, and we know that doctors are performing C-sections without adequate medical supplies on women. So could I ask the Minister, on behalf of the hundreds of constituents who have written to me, to tell me what the UK government is doing to end this blockade on aid, but also to reassure me that our UK government has specifically communicated the sheer urgency on the ground to the Israeli government?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful for the opportunity to comment on particular cases involving constituents in Gaza. I know my honourable friend works incredibly hard for her constituents, as do many others here, and where I am in direct correspondence with people about the fate of their constituents or the relatives of their constituents in Gaza, I will not provide a running commentary from this dispatch box, but all I will say is that the Foreign Office will do everything it can to ensure that British nationals in distress, including in Gaza, and their loved ones are able to get to safety. I can confirm too to the Honourable Lady that we've raised the urgency of these matters with the Israeli government.
Shawkat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Another day, another statement, another day of predictable answers which are both depressing and predictable. And nothing more predictable and depressing as the statement, we are doing everything that we can. Can I ask the Minister, are we really doing everything we can when we haven't called out a genocide and ethnic cleansing as we see it happening in real time? Are we doing everything we can when we haven't even imposed bilateral economic sanctions? Are we doing everything we can when we haven't even called in the ambassador to express our concerns? And if indeed we are doing everything we can I ask the Minister why the government had just sold £9 million worth of technology for Israeli submarines which are being built to house nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Yeah. We are doing everything that we can, and I recognise from the commentary of many members in the House how unbearably frustrating them and their constituents find the situation in which we find ourselves. I have been calling for a ceasefire ever since I have been a minister. It is deeply depressing for me as well to be in this situation today, as I have been so many times in this House, and we will continue to do everything in accordance with the measures that I've laid out this afternoon to try and bring this conflict back to a ceasefire.
James Esher.
Speaker, the Minister has been very generous with his time both today but over the last few months, both in this House and in private meetings. But every time we have met, the situation has been bad and getting worse. And as the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Aberdeen has said, it is now as bad as it has ever been. Does the Minister therefore agree that unless we in the international community take firmer, immediate action as a matter of urgency to force a change, nothing is going to be different, and there will be no point talking about peace or even a two-state solution, because those opportunities will not just be lost for now, but for a generation of foreseeable future, and the consequences to the people of the region, particularly the people of Gaza, are going to be unimaginable.
I thank my honourable friend for his kind words. We have, in the time that we have been the government, we have seen the situation deteriorate, but we have also seen it improve. I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be able to return to this House soon with news that we are back at a ceasefire. I recognise how distant that feels at this moment, but a ceasefire would not just be a vital step towards a two-state solution. It would not just be an enormous contribution to getting aid into Gaza, it would be the step change that is required in order to get into the international diplomacy required to try and bring stability to the region.
Will Forster.
Speaker, with 400 aid workers killed in Gaza in the last 500 days, and it's been a year and a day away from the awful attack on the Central World Kitchen, please can the Minister confirm how many British aid workers are in Gaza and what tangible actions will the government ensure that Israel takes to guarantee their safety?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe I would not be in a position to confirm the current number of British nationals in Gaza as aid workers, but if I am in a position to do so, I'll write to the member. I suspect I won't be, but I'll return if I can.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Hostage Families Forum, which represents most of the captives' families, has said they were horrified this morning when they woke up to the Defence Minister's announcement about expanding military operations in Gaza. They also said that the Israeli government has an obligation to free all 59 hostages from Hamas captivity and to pursue every possible channel to advance a deal for their release. Madam Deputy Speaker, the only time hostages have been released is when there has actually been a ceasefire. And so a ceasefire is paramount to the release of hostages. Now, I'll say to the Minister, if we believe that we should stop bombing Gaza, we need to stop supplying Israel with parts for bombs. If we believe in a two-state solution, it's about time we recognise Palestine.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've provided commentary on the questions of recognition already this evening, and I'll just reassure my honourable friends that we are not providing parts for bombs. We've set out the provisions on arms suspension. There was a question about the global supply chain for F-35 parts, where those parts are going indirectly to Gaza, indirectly to Israel, rather, which I've elaborated in this House on a number of occasions, and that remains the position.
Nearly 24,000 women and children have been killed in Gaza since October the 7th. Evidence submitted to the UN's Human Rights Council show that Israel's use of starvation as a method of war, the denial of humanitarian assistance and the concerted policy to destroy Gaza's healthcare system. Will the government take immediate and tangible steps to demonstrate the UK's commitment to upholding international law and immediately cease provision of military support to Israel, suspend all export licences and impose the two-way arms embargo?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've set out our position in relation to arms suspensions earlier in the session.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Say to the Minister, try and approach it another way. It's quite obvious that Israel has been emboldened by the explicit and implicit support of the US government for what they're doing. That's been a fundamental change. The US government's ruled out a two-state solution, as I understand it. So what has the Minister been doing or can do to work with our colleagues in the European Union and in the Arab states to develop a clear plan for a two-state solution and a clear time frame when all countries will recognise a Palestinian state?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as you would expect, I won't seek to characterise the foreign policy of others when they do so themselves. On the question of cooperation and coordination, we've been in extensive dialogue with those involved with the Arab Initiative. We have worked with Germany, France and Italy in joint statements to that effect and on wider issues recently, and I expect that in June we will join an important international conference in relation to a two-state solution where we will discuss this with our partners.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Time and time again we have heard ministers from that dispatch box talk about how they are trying to do everything they can, the diplomatic levers they are trying to pull. But we all know that since the ceasefire was broken by Israelis not complying, 1,100 people have been killed, mainly women and children. 15 aid workers assassinated. We know they were assassinated because some of them had their hands tied behind their back. The Minister knows that there's only 3 actions that we can implore: stop trade, sanctions, and recognising Palestine. These are the only actions that this government can take to prevent Israelis from causing more damage. Which one will he take?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman knows I was a diplomat before, and it is diplomacy ultimately that is going to resolve this conflict, and that is the lever to which we must most vigorously apply ourselves.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. But just suppose that we closed our airbase in Cyprus, and just suppose we applied greater sanctions, and just suppose we withdrew those export licences, and just suppose we recognise the state of Palestine. Will the Minister be making the same statement, and what analysis has he made of that?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's hard enough to respond to the facts as they are. I won't be drawn by my honourable friend to get into quite such a complex chain of hypotheticals.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for his answers and for his understanding and his honesty as well. Minister, Hamish terrorists, they're murderers, they're rapists, they're child killers. They hide their AK-47s and their weaponries in children's beds. They hide their missiles in their schools, in their hospitals and in their houses. So what steps has the Minister and Government taken with the UN to bring all of the kidnapped hostages home alive, rather than the coffins that were paraded by Hamas terrorist murderers around at the last hostage handover? And underline that the Israelis would not be intensifying their plans to strike were the murderous Hamas not continuing to hold hostages and to fire rockets into Israel daily.
We have worked with our partners in the region, with the Israeli government, with the US and many others to try and secure the safe release of all those with UK links who have been held hostage. Of course, we want to see all hostages released, but it is to the British nationals and those with links to the UK that we have in the most focused way, turned our efforts. And it has been heartbreaking for me, as it has been for so many in this House. It has been so joyful to see British nationals escape from Hamas clutches alive, and it has been a heartbreak when British-linked nationals have returned deceased. And I know this whole House will be hoping for Avinat Anor and for all others being held to be returned alive, well, and soon.
It's McIntyre.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, many women and children, by Israeli forces is simply heartbreaking. And the Minister knows that I've been raising my concerns and the concerns of my Gloucester constituents with him since I was elected to this House last July. And I'm grateful and appreciate the steps that he and the government are taking on aid and on arms. But yet, here we are. So what more can the government do to stop the killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, to ensure the release of all the remaining hostages, and to ensure that aid gets those who so desperately need it in Gaza?
I thank my honourable friend for his question and for his persistence on these issues. So many of my colleagues on these benches and on the others have raised the plight of Palestinian civilians, the plight of hostages, with real force and real urgency ever since we became the government, and I am sure that they will continue to do so. We will continue to take the steps that I've outlined in order to try and effect a change. We recognise the greater urgency that is upon us all as military activity intensifies, and I hope to return to this House in due course with updates on our diplomatic efforts.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, of which the UK is a signatory, states have an obligation to prevent and punish genocide. The obligation to prevent involves acting now, acting immediately. Can the Minister outline what the government is doing, some steps, what those steps are, to ensure that genocide is prevented in Gaza?
The honourable member will have heard my previous comments about determinations. I'll answer the question which I think he's asking is, what have we done since we've become the government in order to try and reduce the suffering in the occupied Palestinian territories and indeed in Israel? And we have taken steps. We have taken firm steps, far-reaching steps, whether it's on the suspension of arms, the restoration of funding to UNRWA, using our role at the Security Council, raising these questions with force, with the Israeli government, with all relevant regional partners. We are working night and day to try and ensure that those in harm's way are no longer at risk. I recognise today, as we have had on almost every day since we've been in the government, that there is yet more to do.
Deputy Speaker, since Hamas's war crimes of October the 7th, we've seen multiple flagrant breaches of the rules of the international order. This week, 15 Palestinian paramedic Red Crescent workers found in a mass grave alongside their abandoned emergency vehicle, on top of a now 4-week total aid blockade. So can I ask my honourable friend, what are our red lines about how this war without end, where ceasefire signed agreements could be tossed aside, is being conducted?
Our position on the conduct of war is international humanitarian law. We have set out the risks, our concerns of breaches, and we continue to take actions in line with that assessment.
Paula Barker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, over 300 Palestinian children have been killed since Israel's new offensive. What worries me about the government is that it doesn't seem to have any red lines that Israel can cross. We need robust action, not words. The two-state solution is on its knees. The two-state solution is not a byproduct of peace, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is the route to peace. So with that in mind, if recognition is not now, then when? And what will the government's response be when Israel permanently occupy parts of Gaza, as their defence minister seems to be insinuating?
My honourable friend has got a long commitment to these issues. I know she's travelled to the region, and she is right to say that the two-state solution must be central. She asks about annexation, and I can be clear once again from this dispatch box that we want a resolution which provides for occupied Palestinian territories to be Palestinian consistent with the relevant Security Council resolutions.
Andrew Pates.
Deputy Speaker, can I commend the Minister for the care and concern he takes updating this House, but we keep coming back to the same point in the situation. And this morning's announcement by the Israeli government about more incursions is condemnable. We all know where this leads. Over the last year and a half, we've seen mass displacement. It leads to suffering, it leads to hostages not being released, and it leads us closer to the abyss. Would the Minister join with me in making clear that any forcible transfer of Palestinian civilians and any annexation of Palestinian territory is unacceptable and would be a breach of international law?
My honourable friend remains deeply committed to these issues, and I'm pleased to reassure him we do not support the expansion of military operations by Israel announced this morning, and we continue to oppose forced displacement of the Palestinians. Palestinian territory must not be reduced in the conduct of this war.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the past few days, the worst extremist Ben Gvir has rejoined the Israeli government. Red Crescent medics have been killed by Israeli forces, and Israel has started a fresh ground invasion with the killing hundreds of women and children and with a specific intention of annexing Palestinian territory. After every atrocity and illegal act, the Foreign Office expresses its concern, and then things get worse. Has the Minister considered what steps the government should take to actually make things get better on the ground for Palestinians and Israelis?
I thank my honourable friends. Of course, it is the thought in our mind every day as we see the imagery ourselves, as we're sent it by our colleagues and our constituents. Every day, this government sees for its own, with its own eyes the degree of horror in Gaza, and every day we ask ourselves what it is that we can do to try and ensure that this goes in the direction of our policy, not in the direction that it has done, which has been to end the ceasefire, which has led far too many hostages to continue to be detained, that aid restrictions have continued long after I and others have called for them to end. And of course, as he would expect, every day these questions haunt us.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you,
Madam Deputy Speaker. And we're back here again. Aid workers shot dead and dumped in a shallow grave. Hunger used as a weapon of war. Hospitals bombed. And now new plans to seize large areas of Gaza. And all that in just the last few days. Israel is carrying out war crime after war crime. And on the 29th of December, the Foreign Office issued a press release rightly referring to Russian war crimes. So I don't see why there is reticence here. I'm afraid that expressions of concern are not enough. When is the government going to act and treat Israel as it has rightly treated Russia and impose serious sanctions?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've set out the steps we have taken, the sanctions we have issued, and I'll continue to return to this House with further updates.
Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recognise what the Minister has said about what has been done, but in light of the current desperate situation, what is the Minister's assessment of what more could be done through diplomatic efforts to ensure Israel allows humanitarian aid in at speed and at scale, but also in support of the Arab Initiative to ensure that Gaza is rebuilt as part of a viable and a recognised Palestinian state?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to work with our partners who are party to the Arab Initiative and indeed our partners in the United Nations Security Council, where we have called sessions, issued statements, and we will continue to work along those lines in the way that the member would expect.
Brian Leishman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have a simple question looking for a very simple answer. Does the government recognise Israel's plan for large-scale forced evacuations in Gaza as ethnic cleansing? And if not, why not?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we continue to oppose forced displacement in Gaza.
James Naish.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to put on record my sincere desire to see the Israeli hostages returned as soon as possible. The International Development Committee recently spent time in Geneva as part of its inquiry on international humanitarian law, and one of the things that we discussed at length was how countries are increasingly conflating the legality of resorting to war with the legality of conduct in war. And in this particular situation, we see aid being blocked and lands being annexed without, it seems, legitimate justification or even significant condemnation. So can the Minister please explain what the government is doing to ensure that international humanitarian law stops being openly broken and is given the respect it deserves?
My honourable friend and East Midlands colleague is right to raise the deterioration of the application of international humanitarian law. There are too many places currently in conflict where the conduct of hostilities looks to have very, very serious risk of breaches of IHL, and we are doing all that we can, both in Geneva, New York, and indeed on the ground in these places, whether they are in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories or elsewhere, to try and ensure that the breaches of IHL that are at risk do not continue.
Can I thank the Minister for coming to the House this afternoon to respond to questions. There'll now be a brief interlude whilst the front benches swap over.